edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. If this is your first time tuning in the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein. Count them two. We are that much closer to the 2024 NFL Draft. So much to talk about within these next 2 days. There's going to be a lot of buzz throughout the draft weekend. And because it is draft week, we obviously thought to ourselves, we need to get some insider knowledge as far as what's happening in the locker room. And like I say many, many times, when Dan Wolkenstein works the phones, great things tend to always happen. So, Dan, before we get into all this, let's talk about who is joining Chargers Unleashed today.
Yes, ESPN reporter, an incredible one, I might add. Kris Rhim has done incredible work covering the Chargers. He will be joining us to talk all things NFL Draft. We'll talk about the Jim Harbaugh, Joe Hortiz mentality, what he's predicting, some expectations, what the Chargers could possibly do at positions of need, the wide receiver versus tackle position, what they're going to do at 5, possibly trade down, all of that. We'll get into all of it with Kris Rhim. Incredible guy, and excited to have him on. It's long overdue, so pumped to have him on. But Jake, before we get to that, let's pay the bills. Let's talk about our friends.
I want to remind everybody the quickest way to get into all of these sports action out there, it's Underdog Fantasy and their pick-em game. Just pick between 2 and 5 of your favorite or least favorite players to create a lineup and take home some cold, hard cash. Underdog matches up to $500 deposits, $500 on your initial deposit. Just make sure when you go over there, use the promo code Unleashed. That's Unleashed. So go on over to Underdog Fantasy today and let them know that Chargers Unleashed sent you.
Kris Rhim from ESPN joins us next on Chargers Unleashed. Well, the Chargers NFL Draft, every NFL draft for every team, starts in 2 days, and we have a great show lined up for you. Incredible guest, ESPN reporter, covers the Chargers, Mr. Kris Rhim. Does it incredibly, in my opinion, by the way. Recently put out an article, really insightful, I thought, outlining Hortiz and Harbaugh's draft history and what it could possibly mean for the upcoming draft. We'll put it in the description of the show, actually, for those who haven't read it, because I 10 out of 10 recommend it. Kris, excited to have you on the show, man. It's been way too long time coming. Welcome.
Thanks, man. Glad to be here.
Of course. You can find Kris at Kris Rhim 1 on X, KrisRhim 1 on X. Lots to talk about. We'll talk about kind of setting the stage here for the NFL Draft, some of the biggest positions of need, the BPA versus offensive line discussion, which Kris actually talked about a bit in his article, which we'll highlight here. Harbaugh and Hortiz's mentality, as well as we'll get some of Kris's expectations and predictions. But I guess, Kris, just to kind of set the stage here, the Chargers have gone out in free agency and made a bunch of several either mid or low cost, mostly short-term signings that appear to prove real value for specific needs, but also shaved a ton of cap space. You talk about Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and a bunch of the other things that they did, a lot of free agents who are no longer on this team. How do you see those moves signaling how this team finalizes their draft board for this week?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't look too much into those moves as far as saying, maybe they're going to go away from said position because of who they signed. None of these moves really strike to me as okay, the Chargers really filled a need or something, or they're good here, they're fine here outside of quarterback, and maybe I don't know, maybe safety, I don't know, but that's how I would kind of look at the roster with these moves. I think the moves are good. They're good depth moves. I think they're back everything they've said, but yeah, I wouldn't say it impacts too much on the draft what they've done.
It's kind of speaking about free agency moves that have been speculated, not necessarily have taken place, but we've seen rumors and reports of the Chargers expressing interest and or meeting with the likes of Tyler Boyd, Martez Valdez-Scantling, DJ Chark. What do you make of those meetings? How do you see any of those possible signings playing out, and maybe into what this team is going to do over the draft weekend?
Yeah, well, we know, I covered the Ravens briefly, and the Ravens always are active signing players, late into the season, late into camp. They're always going to be active. So I look at those meetings as preliminary, gauging guys out, trying to see what guys are thinking. And those free agents, too, are waiting to see how the landscape plays out, to see where they want to go, especially those veteran guys, to see what teams do with the draft, how teams look, so they can increase their chances of either winning or getting paid the most money they can. So I would say for those situations, they're encouraging. And it sounds like to me that Joe Hortiz and the Chargers are setting themselves up to be in line to sign some of these players after the draft once they have things better settled, with the roster.
And we all know how unpredictable the NFL draft could be. Even with the Chargers sitting at 5, there's just so much intrigue and mystery as far as how the board's going to fall, what they're ultimately going to do. This Chargers team still needs to build out a ton of depth on both sides of the football. And in order to turn it into what Joe Hortiz and Jim Harbaugh envision for this team, what 2 or 3 positions do you feel are the most important for this team to come away with draft weekend to say they have to come away with X and Y in order to consider this draft to be a success?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as position goes, I think you want to come away wherever it is. You want to come away with a receiver you feel really good about. In my opinion, wherever that is, I would go there. I think, and I would say for 2 and 3, you would also. I also like them coming out of this draft with a cornerback and with an interior lineman. I think those 3 will be the ones I immediately think about with the Chargers. Like that's what I would do if I was them.
I want to touch on that real quick, the fact, because Dan and I have been saying the exact same things in terms of where wide receiver corner is positioned in this draft as far as, need and how big it is considering the depth. I feel like interior defensive line is a position that has kind of been, put on the back burner given the needs above it currently as it stands right now. And we know that when you start looking at the depth chart, obviously the Chargers went out and signed Poona Ford, and you still have some other returning players in there as well with Scott Matlock and Tito. But in terms of what Jesse Minter and this defense want to run, if you were going to be putting a priority on interior defensive linemen as to say day 2, day 3, what seems like the most realistic option in terms of how the board might fall?
Yeah, I mean, as far as players, I try to stay away from like the mock and who goes where, right? I mean, I think a lot of people are looking at like Chris Jenkins or any Michigan guy really like, as far as like where they're going to go. But I think if I had to like project it, I would, as far as investment wise, I guess in my mind, I think like what you said, like day 2 investment kind of player, if that's kind of like running around your question, right? But that's like investment into a player. I think a day 2 investment into that interior defensive line is what I would do. Like get a guy who you feel like could be a contributor legitimately this year for, I think, a position that is a legitimate weak spot for this team, but they have the edge rushers and, how Minter wants to play this defense.
We'll talk about interior offensive line and offensive line in general here in a second, but like, this team and Joe Hortiz and the Ravens and kind of the defense with Minter and Mike McDonald, kind of the same pedigree. Not necessarily specific people, but the archetype of corner that you think that this Chargers team could be looking for. Like what could you foresee this team looking for in terms of traits that they see in corners that would fit this defense?
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody wants those long arm, lanky, fast, kind of can bump you and run with you type of cornerbacks. And if you look at, who the Ravens have had, right, even recently, it's this Marlon Humphrey, it's Brandon Stevens, it's guys that can get into you, guys that can also tackle. So that's what I think that the Chargers are looking for corners that can cover, but corners that can also tackle, which I think, as we know, the Chargers could use some of both.
Yes. Yeah. So all right, let's flip to the topic that probably has most Chargers fans kind of in arms with each other, and it's kind of about like the number 5 overall and just kind of like the chasm between best player available and possibly what this team might want to do in terms of like fit and need. And this kind of goes a little bit towards your article that you wrote this past week, but like so many are hoping for wide receiver at 5 overall if they stay at 5. But we've also heard how important protecting the quarterback and establishing the run is for the staff. But we've also heard Joe Hortiz talk and prove through his time in Baltimore his emphasis on going best player available. This feels like that's what the fans and most pundits like see, and that's why they're so split on what they could or should do in the draft. Like, how do you decipher Hortiz and Harbaugh's process based on what you've heard from the team and the coaching staff and players and everything that you know there so far, on how like they're going to continue to build the team through the draft?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people this time of year, they're going to try their best to keep everything in-house and try their best to say all the right things about, and everyone really kind of goes says they go best player available for the most part. And I think the Ravens mostly did that in Baltimore, but there are some years, I mean, even last year, right? Like when they drafted Zay Flowers, was he the best player available? Maybe. But there was a run on receivers, and they knew they needed a receiver, so they got a receiver, right? So it's like, yeah, they went best player available more often than not, and you have to, like when they got Kyle Hamilton, like Joe said, right? So I do think that the idea that the Chargers are going to go O-line isn't a true one. Like they're locked into that at 5. It isn't true because of what they've said. So many people think because they've talked about how much they want to build the run game and how much they're like Jim Harbaugh has talked about this and that. I just think that Harbaugh, for one, is he just loves football, right? He's a little bit off, like all these coaches, right? Like he just loves football. He just loves running the ball, and that's what he does, right? Like I don't think it doesn't mean like we're gung ho. We have to get a lineman. And to be frank, like the Chargers, I know when we talk about line, we're talking about tackles and we're talking about Trey Pipkins, and when you look at Trey Pipkins, right? His game fluctuates, right? He's been a little bit inconsistent, but I don't think you look at him and you say like he's like an immediate, like we can't run him out there next year to be the starter. And it kind of feels like that sometimes, how the discussion is going, right? So yeah, when you look back at their drafts and you look at what they've done, they've often gone best player available, even in San Francisco, when Jim had a similar situation where the left side of his line was pretty much solid, the right side of his line was kind of middling, average kind of players, right? And they chose safety, chose a receiver. So yeah, I would lean on that, and they're going to pick the guy they feel is the best, especially with this roster.
We're talking to Kris Rhim, ESPN reporter for the Chargers, and so you mentioned kind of interior offensive line being one of the biggest positions of need, and I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of the offensive line struggled last year, and there was a lot, impacted both like the run and the pass game across the line, which is honestly probably why most people who are saying Chargers go offensive line, and it's probably tackle at 5, it's probably why that narrative has like picked so much steam, is because of that. But like based on what you've seen and what you've heard, like where along the offensive line is there the biggest opportunity for actual improvement? Like they got Bozeman, like they have the interior offensive line, but I think that needs help. You mentioned it's the top 3. Trey Pipkins, you could probably say like his average. You can go a little above or below depending on it. Like how do you see the team aiming to solve the offensive line struggles as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of the struggle, well, not a big part of the struggles, but when you look at the line play, like from Rashawn down, right? Like it wasn't a great year for really, most of the line in my vantage point, right? And Rashawn said that as much, throughout the year. He's just like, I wasn't where I should have been. I wasn't playing how I should have played. And then there was also so many injuries on the line, right? Down to third string center by the end of the year. I think for me, when I look at the line, one of the things that I do look at as a player like Zion, like Zion Johnson, I think he has such high potential. When he came in, there's so much excitement about him, right? And then last year, where he's kind of, what I noticed with him mostly was like struggling to getting to kind of that second level of the defense, right? Like getting to, maybe the linebackers when we're blocking or things like that. I mean, that's kind of what you hear when you, not just him, but that's kind of what you hear when you talk about this line and when you look at the numbers, right? I think they were something like 1.8 yards before contact in last season at some point. So I think with this line, it's like you have the players, you have a lot of talent and vets. I think coaching is really important, and they brought in a bunch of people with experience. So yeah, I think they're in an all right spot.
That was, I'm so glad you brought that last part up in terms of coaching goes, because in relation to the Trey Pipkins narrative, and like you were mentioning, it's serviceable. He's not a terrible right tackle, and obviously he was 1 year into a 3-year deal thus far. And in terms of coaching, I feel like is going to bridge so much of the gap, not just on the offensive line, but at multiple different positions this year. Just in terms of with Trey and the revamping of the coaching staff that has now been brought in to head up the offensive line and obviously improve it as a whole. What do you think that their ultimate plan is for him? Do you, in your opinion, do you see them going into this next year to say, Trey Pipkins is going to be the right tackle to start? And obviously we would figure that they would revamp the offensive line one way or another, adding some more depth pieces to it. But in your opinion, do you feel like that is legitimately what they're thinking with this new coaching staff?
Well, I would assume so, yes. But I would say I expect them to bring in competition. Like I wouldn't say that they would go, we're just going to peg him in and we're not going to bring in any competition for that spot. Like they're, even in Baltimore's, open competition kind of everywhere. Obviously without the, Lamar Jackson or Justin Herbert. But yeah, so I would expect it to be competition for Trey. But like you said, he's not, it's almost like he's not a terrible player. Like, and it kind of seems like that has been where this has gone because of how much they've talked about the running game and the offensive line. But yeah, he can play.
Chargers recently brought in and signed running back J.K. Dobbins, which the timing of it was a little bit of a surprise. Dan and I had talked about this back when they were first bringing him in for meetings. And in general, obviously now that running back room is comprised of Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, Isaiah Spiller, Elijah Dotson. How much of an impact do you think? I know that you had said at the beginning of all this that it doesn't necessarily eliminate them going after any of these positions, but how do you think that them now bringing in 2 former Baltimore Ravens running backs, how do you think that ends up impacting that position room? Does it maybe move the position priority down in terms of when they might end up selecting a running back to round out this group?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know some people were stressing, thinking, what if they take Blake Corum like second round or something? But yeah, I would say for sure, like that whole, and that's what I mean when we say, like at the press conference, Joe said that signing JK doesn't change anything about the draft approach. But again, at this time of year, you say what you have to say what you have to. Ultimately, it has to change, right? Like you feel good about that. You kind of feel all right with that room, like so it has to move. It has to move running back down a bit, right? Regardless of what's said publicly, I think it definitely probably moves it down a bit. Not to say that they won't get someone, but moves it down in priority wise.
Let's say that the Chargers stick and pick at 5, and Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't available. Which remaining wide receiver do you feel fits this team, this coaching staff, and just their overall need now that Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are no longer on this roster?
Yeah, I mean, I really do like Malik Neighbors. I think he is potential.
Let's go, Kris. Let's go.
I think I think he has a potential to be, one of those guys, right? And put him in this offense, and I think you're cooking with something exciting. And I don't know. I think there's a lot to like about Neighbors. I think there's a lot to like about, Marvin Harrison Jr. But I don't. When you talk to people around the league too, and this has come out publicly with reports, right? Like I think for a lot of scouts and evaluators, the gap between Neighbors and Marvin isn't significant for a lot of scouts, and some people have Neighbors over Marvin Harrison Jr. And I don't know if that's the majority, but some people do, right? So I think Neighbors, if the Chargers landed Neighbors as a fan, I think people should be really excited because he's dynamic.
And I was going to ask you, and there's been a lot of people, and we've talked about this where, maybe from like a fit perspective, and maybe this is like the thinking back in like the Telesco era of like how they go for certain types of receivers, what would best fit the team versus like breaking the mold. And we've talked a bit about like Odunze or Marvin Harrison Jr. maybe being like the better fit for this Chargers team. in terms of like being an X receiver now that Keenan Allen isn't there and Mike Williams isn't there. But then like we started thinking about like, okay, well, maybe that's not the fit that they want. And maybe they want that like guy who's just a disruptor, who's the cheat code, who can just put, defenses in like maximum conflict. Like, do you think they have a type of receiver they're looking for?
I think the type is less about the build and more about the mentality, right? Like I think the type of receiver they're looking for is just like a dog, right? Like someone
totally Neighbors. That is totally Neighbors.
Like someone who is confident, who is not afraid of contact, who's not afraid to ball. I think that's who they're looking for, right? Because you look at the receivers that, right, like even last year, right, like the I keep going back to this, but they drafted, Zay Flowers, right? Like Zay Flowers is like 5'8". Like he's like 5'8", like 180, right? Like this is not an X or anything like that, but he kind of plays like it, right? Like you don't have to be that big, especially in today's game, right? Like the game has changed so much. Going back to the fit and all of that, I think the fit is more about, I think Jim Harbaugh says this often, like we want your play to talk so much that we can't even hear what you're saying. So that's what it comes down to. I think it's less about the play style being the fit and more of the player's mentality.
And we've heard a lot about this team talk about like they want, like, I'm paraphrasing, but like they want a little bit of crazy. Like they want the guys who are just, you mentioned, like they want the dogs. They want the ones who are going to go out there and just like play with the hair on fire and like back it up. And like that screams like Malik Neighbors. Like you see him with like that chip on his shoulder on like everything. And he just finds slight in any little thing that people say. And I don't know. I was thinking about like the fit thing, and I'm like, maybe they don't have a fit. Like maybe that's not even the fit that we're thinking of.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I wouldn't look too much into. Yeah, right. Like when we're talking about play style, right? Like I think it's more about that. Like get a guy that can do it, and we'll figure it out. Like,
yeah. So okay, we'll round it out here. We always like to, especially during draft season, we like to get kind of predictions or expectations for how folks think the Chargers are going to end up drafting. And I know you weren't big into looking at all the specific players, which is totally fine. Honestly, it's probably smart because there's like 500 of them. But whether that is players or whether that is positions,
okay,
give us your prediction for how things will go in round one. And then maybe we'll just stick to round one and day two.
Okay.
That could be player. It could be scenario, trade down, trade up, whatever.
Yeah.
What are your expectations and predictions for days 1 and 2?
So I think there's actually an ESPN mock draft running tonight on TV. I think that and maybe I'm just buying into the JJ McCarthy hype, but I think the Chargers will trade back with Minnesota. I think they'll get 2 firsts. I don't think they'll get 3 firsts. I think they'll get 2 firsts, a day 2 pick next year, my trade specifically in the ESPN one is 2 firsts, a 4th this year, and a 3 next year. So I think they could get something like that. I don't think they would get 3 firsts, but I think they could get a package like that. And I think if they get that package, they go, unless Brock Bowers is on the board at 11, they go O-line at 11. Then they go corner, unless maybe a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. is there or something, or someone, I don't know. But I think they go corner and then they go receiver 2nd round. So I would predict that. If they trade, I predict trade down, lineman, corner, receiver 2nd round. But in the ESPN draft, I go lineman, receiver. So don't get on me for that.
There's so many different ways that they can go, honestly. And that's what makes this draft specifically with Joe Hortiz and Jim Harbaugh at the helm so intriguing for the Chargers.
Yeah. And I will say, I went receiver because the corners that I had in mind had gone. So I went receiver. That's what had happened. Yeah.
Man, so much, I think, excitement and hype, and I think just like nervousness in the new era of Chargers football.
Let me ask, what do y'all think?
What was yours?
What do y'all think?
I mean, I think it would ultimately end up being a trade down to 11-23 to acquire that. If it was me, my board would actually flip to putting priority at corner with 11. So depending on how the board is, it's either Terrion Arnold, it's Quinyon Mitchell there. Then I would probably come around with 23, and depending on which wide receiver was on the board, I'd probably go that route. 37, I'm really bullish on Zach Frazier. I just love him as a center prospect, and I've seen mock drafts out there with them possibly using 37 for a center prospect. So again, there's so many different ways they could go. Linebacker is another even sneaky option that they could do at 37 there. So lots of possibilities.
Definitely.
For those viewing, my cat was going absolutely ballistic, so I had to go off screen for 3 seconds to let the cat out of the room. So I apologize. So I've been on record. I feel like I have been the leader of the Malik Neighbors caboose since December, and he's legitimately my favorite player of this entire draft class. I can't remember the last time, probably since Jamar Chase, that I've seen a receiver that I like as much as him. And I go back and forth on if they would go Neighbors or Marvin Harrison Jr., and I think they would probably go Marvin Harrison Jr., they being the Chargers. But if he's not there, the Chargers have to stick at 5. I'm praying to all things holy that they go Malik Neighbors. I just think that would be an absolute cheat code.
Yeah.
And the most likely scenario is as much as I would love to see Minnesota trade down and give the haul, I've said to Jake before, I just don't think that this quarterback class, this QB4, is worth trading all of those assets. I mean, if they want to do it, sweet, I'm down.
Right.
I just don't know if they would do it. But hey, maybe they love him. Maybe he's their QB2. If they trade down, though, I think it's full-on offensive line. I wouldn't be shocked at all. Right. And I think most fans probably would be totally fine with offensive line anywhere but 5.
Right.
And it's just anywhere but 5. That's the issue, because I think you think DPA, there's no way that's not one of those receivers. But I would probably say they stick at 5. I'm going to say Malik Neighbors. I'll be doing cartwheels to Jake's house with a lot of shots and something. And then day 2, if they don't leave day 2 without at least they have to get a corner, because this cornerback room is absolutely non-existent, especially on the outside. Honestly, you're praying that Christian Fulton becomes some incredible player that he was 3 years ago, and you're playing that Asante Samuel Jr. can actually be an outside corner. Those are tough odds. So cornerback, Neighbors, and then if they trade back, I mean, I can almost guarantee you it's going to be tackle, but who knows?
Yeah, for sure. No, that sounds good. I like it. I like that for both of you.
Oh, man. Kris, you've been awesome, dude. I appreciate you taking the time to come out here and do this with us. What should Chargers fans expect from you? What are you working on between now and the rest of the week as the draft unfolds?
Yeah, thank you. So, happy to be on. And, I was working on – got the mock draft running on ESPN tonight. I'm not sure what time, but it'll be on TV at some point where, all the 32 reporters, we make our picks. And I kind of leaked it here, my picks. But, I think for me, you should expect a couple features running, after the draft. Obviously, I'll have some post-draft stuff on whoever they pick, and then, some stuff leading into the year and some national stuff. So just be on the lookout. It should be an exciting year for everybody in the Harbaugh era.
I love it. Kris Rhim, everybody. You can find Kris on X at Kris Rhim1, KrisRhim1. Again, I'll leave the link to your latest article, Kris, in the description for folks who have not already seen it. Definitely recommend watching or reading that one before the draft starts, so you guys put your minds at ease a bit. Kris, you've been awesome, man. Appreciate you coming on. You're a friend of the show. Welcome anytime, all right?
Thank you, y'all.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks, Kris.